joining us, and sorry about the slightly late start. My name's Wendy Hermiston. I'm a Wiradjuri woman from New South Wales in Australia, for anyone joining us from overseas. And I'm the Senior Research Fellow, or one of the Senior Research Fellows in the team at the National Centre for Mental Health Research Translation. And we're based in Melbourne, at the University of Melbourne. And before we start today, I'd just like to take a minute and just thank you all for being here and acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands and in the skies and waterways where we're all meeting, and give my respects to elders past, present and emerging. For me, I'm on the lands of the Bunurong people in the Kulin Nation, and that's in the lands currently now known as Victoria. And I want to acknowledge any other First Nations and Indigenous peoples attending today. And feel free to add into the chat where you're sharing, where you're joining us from. And I'm also sharing an artwork here by Gamilaroi artist and his Gamilaroi, Dennis Golding. It's called Healing from the Ground, and that's a special artwork that he created for the Alive National Centre that represents the work that our network does. And I'm here today to introduce some wonderful international speakers who are joining us today. That's Meenakshi Richardson, Cary Waubanascum and Sara Waters. And we're also joined by Michelle Sarche, who's they're all joining us from Turtle Island overseas, and that is the United States and Canada for anyone unfamiliar with that term. And they'll be joining us to speak on the paper that they had published earlier this year, and that's on reclaiming Indigenous ways for the future of Indigenising infant and early childhood mental health. So they'll be adding some links in here to their work, so you'll be able to follow it up and read the paper if you haven't seen it already. It was in the invitation for anyone who wants to access that work as well. I just want to add a note on the language that we add into all our virtual cafe series, and it's just about a note on language. If you can just be aware that we want to make sure that we have, I guess, acknowledgement and sensitivity for the many people that join us, that bring a wealth of experience, and that comes from all sorts of areas of mental health, mental ill health, distress, suicide, and social and emotional well-being. And so some of the language that we use and bring to this space can come from a different perspective, and those perspectives might not be what are preferred by others that join. So there can be an experience of discomfort, and if you can just have a break if you need, if anything is upsetting as well, grab a cup of tea and come back and join us when you're ready. If you need to leave the session, yeah, you're welcome to do that. And there's a link in the chat that's on our Alive National Centre page about ways to engage as well. And we, besides acknowledging country, we also just like to acknowledge the lived experience that people bring, and we just want to speak honourably and respectfully about the ongoing emotional distress and experiences of trauma and mental ill health, and the work of caring and experiences of care within this context. So you can keep that in mind as well, that recognition. And yeah, I'll just finally, I am going to hand over after this slide to one of our co-directors, Dr. Vicky Palmer, and she's one of the directors of the centre that will explain the work in more detail. But I'm just going to run over it very briefly for anyone who isn't familiar with the work of our centre. And the Alive National Centre, our aim is transforming mental health and wellbeing through primary care and community action. And so our vision is vibrant communities that support mental health and promote wellbeing to enable people to thrive. Our values are lived expertise, practice wisdom, outcomes-driven, inclusive, authentic, and brave. And the streams of research at our centre are prevention across the life course, longer, healthier lives in priority populations, lived experience research collectives, and mental health care at scale. The networks are the co-design living labs, and we have the Implementation and Translation Network, the Next Generation Researcher Network, and the Lived Experience Research Collective, and the Alive Collective. I do have some numbers, but we might come back to that for that membership. And if you'd like to find out more, or you want to join any of the networks that I just mentioned, you can jump onto our website, and that's alivenetwork, all one word, .com.au. And I'll just hand over to you now, Vicky.
Thanks, Wendy, and thank you to our guests today for joining, and I'll acknowledge country as well, joining from Wurundjeri land. And thank you, Wendy, for taking us through Dennis's beautiful artwork around healing from the ground, which I suppose reflects all of our intention in the centre to work from the bottom up. In the next slide, we also have another beautiful piece of work as well, that's around the casting the net that's coming up after the other slide that Dana's going to go back to. But yeah, we have our quarterly forum. We operate a quarterly update in the centre to keep everyone across everything that we're doing. As Wendy pointed out, we've got a lot of networks. We are sharing some further information about our project on loneliness, which is working with folks 18 to 25 around the impacts of loneliness, particularly during big life changes. And casting the net, we're going to give some further information to our next piece of work that's very much around driving for equitable wellbeing and mental health systems transformation, and important to all of the conversation today. The new piece of work that Phil has created, who's our Gumbaynggirr Aboriginal research and co-design lead in the centre, is around the stepping stones that formed in casting the net for what matters. The stepping stones in the middle represent some of our existing work called Whose Care, Our Care. All of our work is focused on forming participatory ecosystems, creating connections between spaces and places. So trying to honour and learn in two-way approaches about culturally led knowledge systems and First Nations governed and led processes, as well as improving mental health care across a number of different sites and suicide prevention sites. So this particular piece is beautiful to reflect on. You'll see it in the e-zine. We'll be sharing it widely. So we'll move on, Dana, so that we can hear from our international guests more importantly. But it is situated within the conversation today, within our roadmap and all of our work in terms of equitable wellbeing. This just gives a highlight. The beige is sort of representing work we already had underway, to new work starting in the green. So this just is situating the conversation in our roadmap, which is always centred on the priorities of people most impacted and driven from the ground up. So I think from there, Dana, is that coming up to back to you, Wendy? These are the fantastic leads in the roadmap, giving you a sense of it is more than Wendy and I and the people on the call. We are a very large group. We're across the nation. When you take all of our networks and all of our things into account, there's probably a 3,000 plus membership base. Obviously, we don't have everyone engaging in every single thing all of the time, but we are a large group and we are moving in lots of different spaces. And today's is a very important conversation that is very central to equitable wellbeing. So over to you, Wendy, and the team, and thank you again for joining us from your lands.
So yes, I'd just like to introduce our guest speakers today, and we're very honoured and very happy that they're able to join us. It was quite interesting trying to work out a time that we could not have a presentation that was in the middle of the night for them or for us, and working that out was a lot of fun. So we're very grateful that you can join us, and we have joining us Dr. Meenakshi Richardson. Meena is a citizen of the Haliwa-Saponi Tribe, and is of Indo-Fijian descent as well. Dr. Cary Waubanascum is a citizen of Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, and also of the I'm sorry, Cary, please forgive my pronunciation, but it's Wakanina, the Turtle Clan, with ancestral roots in Meenakshi, Forest Country, Potawatomi, and Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mahitian Nations. We also have Dr. Sara Waters. Sarah's a white woman, mother, daughter, and sister living in the homelands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, and other bands of Chinook peoples along the Columbia and Willamette rivers of the Pacific Northwest. And also we have Dr. Michelle Sarche, and Michelle's a citizen of Lakota Orels, band of Ojibwe tribe, and I'm really sorry. I did have the pronunciations correct, but I think I may have mispronounced, and I'm very sorry about that. And an urban Native community member in Denver, and that's in Chicago. So I'll just hand over to you now. If you can share your screens, that would be great.
Bilahuk Wendy, Donna, and everyone at the center for inviting us to gather with you today. We're so honored and grateful to be able to share knowledge and exchange our knowledge and traditional ways of knowing across the waters. I think the four of us would like to do our traditional introductions as well, to really ground ourselves in this space together, and also to share our ancestors and our families with you. So Mimatuluknatwa Minosains Henuguyasa. So greetings to all of you. I am a citizen of the Haliwa-Saponi Tribe of North Carolina. The name gifted to me is Minosains, which in our Tutelo-Saponi language means little moon. And I'm also of Indo-Fijian descent. My mother is an immigrant from the Fiji Islands. She grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia. And so I'm very grateful and honored to carry those two rich cultures and traditions in the way that I go about being a good relative, and being a community member in the way that we're serving our families and strengthening our kinship ties. I also am an assistant scientist, which is a research faculty position at the Center for Indigenous Health at Johns Hopkins University. But much like Sarah, I live on the lands of several tribal communities that call these lands home along the Columbia River and Willamette Valley in Portland, Oregon. So I'll pass it over to Cary.
Sagoli swagwake, Cary Waubanascum wapanoso niunget swaganyanta niwagita loda, onyoteaga niwagahun joda, okale manamani parawatami and Stockbridge. And I just spoke to you in my Oneida language, where I live and raise my family on the Oneida Nation reservation here in Wisconsin. And I also told you that I'm of the Turtle Clan, which was passed to me from my mother, her mother, and all the mothers before her. We are a matrilineal society. I am currently an assistant professor of Indigenous Health at the University of North Dakota. But like I said, I live and work here on the Oneida Reservation. And so that's me. And I'll pass it to Dr. Sara Waters for her introduction.
Thanks, Cary. Hello, I'm Dr. Sara Waters. My ancestry is Irish, English, Norwegian, Italian, Western Europe kind of mix. And as has already been mentioned, I live in the lands of the tribes along the Columbia River and in the Willamette Valley in Portland, Oregon. Thank you. I'll hand it to Michelle.
well, it's afternoon here in Denver, Colorado, where I live, and I reside as a member of the large urban Native community here. I've spent most of my life living in urban Native communities in the United States, including here in Denver and in Chicago. The majority of Native people in the United States actually live in urban areas, and so I'm one of those urban tribal citizens. I am also a tribal citizen of the Lakoutere Band of Ojibwe tribe. Lakoutere is French for Lake of the Short Ears, and that's where my grandmother, Rose Larange Huff, was born and raised. And I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I do a lot of work in early childhood, especially some programs here in the US called Head Start, maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting, tribal childcare programs, to name just a few. I am a professor at the University of Nebraska at an early childhood institute there. But before that, and up until December 1st of last year, I was on the faculty of the Centers for American Indian and Alaska Native Health at the University of Colorado for 27 years. So it's wonderful to be joining you all today.
Bila hook to all of you. And let me just share my screen here. Great. And again, Bila hook to all of you, many thanks for gathering for us to really share about the work that we've done collaboratively together, focusing on reclaiming our Indigenous ways of knowing for the future of infant and early child mental health within our communities. And first and foremost, we really want to ground in immense gratitude for the communities, as well as Indigenous scholarship and early career programming that really has supported our work as we move forward, and just a real testament to Dr. Sarche and Dr. Waters' support of early career scholars such as Cary and myself, who, although we're categorized as early career because maybe we've recently received our PhDs, we've been working within our community and serving our communities for many years, right? And this work is embedded within our traditions and is very close to our heart and to our peoples. And so we just really want to honor those Indigenous nations as well as the communities and programs that we're highlighting here today. This work, as Wendy had mentioned, is a part of a manuscript that was recently published through the Infant Mental Health Journal that's focused around early career scholars' intentional application of DEI and other anti-racist perspectives. And so some of the information may be familiar to you, some of it may not be. And so we're really grateful to you for joining today as we highlight some of the work around reclaiming our ways of knowing in this field. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Cary.
Sagoli, thank you. I wanted, just before I start this, I just want to say that I was also a practicing social worker for 10 years prior to getting my PhD. And then I was also a social work educator prior to coming to University of North Dakota. And I like to say that social work has a long entanglement and a long history of colonization, colonial complicity around child welfare, especially. But one of the reasons why I ground my work in this perspective around colonization and decolonization within child welfare is because I was really sick and tired of journal articles and researchers framing us in a way that individualized the problem. And so I wanted to reframe how child welfare is talked about, how it's presented, and present it from this here. So starting at the very tippy top, the coloniality of power as a global thing that is ongoing. So I drew from global Indigenous scholars like Anibal Quijano, who explained that world capitalism is based on two main axes. So we have the coloniality of power. We have world capitalism and race. And so he argued that world capitalism emerged as a structure centered on labor, production, and exploitation that relied on the racialization of people to gain power and control over them in order to control labor, resources, and ultimately land. And so colonization is a land-centered, it's land-centered and all for for capitalism. And so I always say leave it to the women to step in and say, hey, you're missing something. And so I also studied upon Maria Lugones, who came in and said, hey, race, yes, race was an imposed biological construct, but gender was also an imposed, very distinct dichotomous hierarchical logic that was also equally imposed as race. So the genderization and racialization of our people all fed into that. This coloniality of power, and it imposed upon us this Eurocentric notions of gender and sexuality, where white men were superior to all others, and this provided justification for violence and oppression among our people. She also Lugones also talked about sites of resistance. So, you know, that's where we get into thinking about decolonizing from all of this. So can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. So expanding on the coloniality of power, Lasta Nova and Walter Mignolo, they talk about this colonial matrix of power to kind of like operationalize these ideas. And so they argued that they explained that we all live in these unique global regions where we have our unique histories. So if you look at like in the United States, every tribe is distinct and different, but we have these shared histories within this universe under this shared colonial matrix of power. And so this coloniality and this matrix, it is in everything. It's in society, it's in language, it's in everything that we do. It's suffused everything that we know. And in order to gain control and domination of one society over the other, it happened through these four spheres. And so we have the control over land through economic control, the control over authority through military and police, and we see this stuff is ongoing today, control over gender, family, and sexuality, and control over knowledge through education. My work in child welfare really centers on sphere 3, the control over gender, family, sexuality. And I argue that when I mentioned social workers, they had a big role in shaping child welfare. And so I argued that the history as child welfare evolved into what it looks like today. And there are implications and explanations for all this in infant and early childhood mental health. But I argue that starting with, well, in the late 1800s over here, we had boarding schools. I call them carceral boarding schools. I don't even know why schools are in the name. And then residential schools up in Canada. And that kind of evolved in order to assimilate us forcefully and violently, brutally, murderously, to assimilate our people, evolved into Indian adoption projects. And I'll talk a little bit, I have another slide on that, but I just want to say, if you want to go back one, Mina. Can you go back one more? Okay, so they also talk about decolonial thinking, delinking, or decolonization. Our communities use different words. Scholars use different words, but to me, what that means and what Lastanova and Mignolo say is that it's breaking free from knowing and being under the colonial matrix of power to, quote, unlearn the thinking imposed upon us by education, cultural, and social environment. Next slide. Next. So a little bit about this historical context. So Michelle and I, we published a paper back in 2024. And I started the paper out with this sentence, and I prayed on this statement because this is like, it was a culmination of thinking and praying about how I needed to start this out. And so I want to read this quote to you. For hundreds of years, settler governments have violently removed Indigenous people from our mothers. First, we were forced from our Mother Earth, our lands. Then we were abducted from the mothers who birthed us, forced into carceral boarding schools, and adopted far away from our homes. And so we always think about, because in many of our languages, we refer to this earth as our mother. And so that removal has always been the separation from our mothers, and it continues today. Next slide, please. And in 1928, there was this document called the Miriam Report that looked at assimilation, the status of assimilation among us. And this is one quote that really stuck out to me. The long continued policy of removing Indian children from the home and placing them for years in boarding school largely disintegrates the family and interferes with developing normal family life. The belief has apparently been that the shortest road to civilization is to take children away from their parents and insofar as possible to stamp out the old Indian life. So the big goal here was, first it was to totally erase us, to exterminate us. So that's an era in this country's history, but then it moved on to assimilation. And so that's where the child welfare, like the boarding schools, the other assimilation projects had come in into play. Next slide, please. And so some of that history includes, like I said, boarding schools and residential schools where they focused on these four main aims of the boarding schools were assimilation into Christianity. We didn't know anything about Christianity before settlers came here. We had our own sources of spirituality and practices, many of which revolved around the natural world, and then forced English upon us. There are hundreds of different languages, and many of them are on the verge of extinction, and many of us are doing the hard work to reclaim and revitalize them. Also individualism. And so we have always been a collective people, thinking about how we take care of each other in our kinship structures, but the individualism was forced upon us. And then how to be a good citizen. How do you that was another aim that was forced upon us in boarding and residential schools. In 1887 and around that same time in the late 1800s, the Dawes Allotment Act was passed. Now our lands were held. We didn't know anything about private property. The land was our mother, and we were stewards of the land. And so the Dawes Allotment Act came in and broke up our lands into personal property, and that's how property came to be, to further assimilate us and to individualize us. Things in the early 1900s, family education programs came to be as part of the assimilation projects, where as part of those allotted lands from the Dawes Allotment Act, families were broken up into these gender roles where women were trained by these field matrons to do these like the homemaking roles, right? And the men were taught to farm these lands. So further taking our people out of the ways that we lived in our natural ways of subsistence. And then the Indian Adoption Project, where social workers were they removed almost 800 children for the purposes of assimilation. And the implications of child removal that we still see today are in historical trauma, historical unresolved grief, and intergenerational trauma, and it's ongoing today in child welfare. Next slide, please. And I just want to touch on this really quick because I mentioned the Dawes Allotment Act in the late 1800s. Anna Lawrence Dawes was a social worker. She's one of the first social workers in the late 1800s to call for the professional training of social workers. And she just so happened to be the daughter of Senator Dawes, who authored the Dawes Allotment Act. She was also in cahoots with Captain Henry Pratt, who was the designer of the boarding school and came up with the saying, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." So I just want to really drive home on how closely connected these people were and their mission for assimilation of our people. Next slide, please. And you can skip this one. That was just a quote from Miss Dawes, but I really want to focus on this because this was taken from the paper that was published, and this shows just pretty much what I talked about, and it's really grounded in, this was a qualitative study, and it's grounded in Indigenous relative caregivers' experiences with the child welfare system today. And so they talked about these things, these continued removal, perpetuating ongoing colonial violence, saying that child welfare is a colonial stressor that triggers historical trauma, and those types of things. So you can take a look at this slide and read that. But it's pretty much what I talked about. But what I want to, that red circle there, what is the purpose of all this? So the purpose of is identifying how colonization has impacted us, learning that history, because we're not taught this history in any school, right? And but I want to point to that red circle because these are the things that we are doing in our own communities. We are leading these efforts of uncovering coloniality to discern, insist, resist, reclaim, revitalize, and reawaken. There's so many other words that we use in our communities, but we are doing the work to do all of this for ourselves so that we can heal and that we can reawaken who our ancestors intended us to be. So with that, I will transition to Meena because she's going to talk a little bit more about that reclamation. Thank you.
Yes, Bila Hukari. And so exactly, like how are we moving away, delinking and decolonizing, and really moving towards reclaiming our ways of knowing for healthy development and our well-being? And so in thinking about decolonizing and delinking, how do we understand that within the context of the field of infant and early childhood mental health, right? Cary spoke to this a bit within the field of social work, and you'll find that in many fields, Western ideology and colonial logics are really embedded within systemic roots and intertwined in how knowledge is shared, how knowledge is identified, right? And when we think about our communities, we really want to root in our Indigenous ways of knowing in our worldview, that really centers in our relationality, in our cultural norms, our protocols, our connection, the ways in which we understand that we are a part of the whole, and removing ourselves from these ideas around individualism, that we are separate from the land, separate from our water and our more than human relatives, and understanding, like Cary had mentioned, around our caregiving practices, right? Moving beyond Western understandings of family systems, such as nuclear family systems, right? This idea that you have a mother and a father and you have your children, that's it, you're in one environment. Well, that's not the case within many of our communities. There's diverse family systems, and we really want to honor that in this field moving forward, especially on reclaiming our life ways and understanding that our culture and our identities and our security and our healing, and even understanding attachment within our communities is really vital for our young people's healthy development. And also a part of this is thinking about seven generations philosophy, right? Acknowledging all the love and the generosity and prayers that our ancestors had breathed life into us for us to be here today, strong and thriving, and acknowledging those alongside us, like who these amazing women that I get to work with and this amazing community that came here today to share knowledge across waters. And then thinking about healthy development in the future, right? To break those cycles of power and really influence well-being that spans future generations, because we sow seeds and we grow seeds for the future. We're not just thinking about the present day in this current plane. We think about children in the future. And I found this is really beautiful. It was on Reach Out Australia, but it came from Australia, and just understanding a bit to what Cary was speaking about is this historical, political, and social context, and how our holistic well-being of country, our environment, our culture, our community, our diverse spiritual practices, our holistic well-being, and our understanding of family and kinship systems really impact the way that we understand our development. And so we want to highlight a couple of amazing examples of reclaiming our Indigenous ways of knowing, one of which maybe you're familiar with. And again, the information and context that we're sharing is within the context of Turtle Island specifically in the United States. But the Indian Child Welfare Act, right, ICWA, really aimed to reduce involvement and interactions of Indigenous children and families in the mainstream Western child welfare system. and really halting and minimizing the removal of Indigenous children from their communities and from their families. So the aim was to protect the best interest of Indigenous children and really think about how are we fostering security, stability, and cultural continuity when we place and support children within family systems with their relative, with their aunties, with their uncles, with their elders in the community, as opposed to removing them from their community entirely, even geographically, into non-native homes. Another beautiful example is the tribal maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting programs, to which Michelle spoke to and was instrumental in forming alongside several other Indigenous scholars and community members, nations, and allies. But the home visiting model, which kind of envelops evidence-based programming, which is critical for supporting caregiver and child health. So the programs focus on it's embedded within the Administration for Children and Families. So it's one of the biggest investments in Indigenous families at the government level. And it's focused on early childhood well-being, minimizing risk within our communities. And two of them specifically are the Nutsaksvik, which is a program that's focused on nurse-family partnership modeling within the South Central Foundation, which is a community-based organization and clinic in Alaska. And it's focused on pairing and really adapting traditional ways of knowing and approaches with nurse care, right? So working with families to expand parenting skills, to connect with their children, provide support and education, lactation support, and just promote overall health and well-being. Another program is the Family Spirit Model, which was developed with 3 nations in the Southwest and with the Center for Indigenous Health at Johns Hopkins. It started in 1995, and it's a program that really supports, again, parenting knowledge, caregiver interactions, generational healing, reducing caregiver stress, and has impacted a lot of different other health outcomes across the years. And what's amazing is that I continue to be a part of that legacy of Family Spirit and supporting the long-term follow-up study, which is working with parents from that original cohort in 1995. So the mothers are now in their 30s, and their children are now adults. And we're seeing, what was that impact? What has Family Spirit, what has the connection to culture and community been like for you? A big proponent of Family Spirit too is that it was focused on training community members as paraprofessionals to provide the services and implement the curriculum and the modules. And so that's again, how are we providing opportunities to really strengthen knowledge systems and knowledge sharing within our communities through programs such as this. Also, you may know that the Family Spirit program also was funded by the Lego Foundation recently and has expanded internationally in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So I can drop a link in that if you're interested. But also a big part of this work is breastfeeding and chest feeding programming and what that means in coalition building within our communities, and really understanding and returning to our ways of milk as medicine, as our first sacred food. And these programs and these coalitions are just amazing examples of this work that's being done in reclaiming our cultural ways that's specific to regions, but also, like Cary mentioned before, really exemplifies the diversity within our tribal nations. For example, there are federally recognized tribes, there are state recognized tribes, there are tribes that do not have any political status, and what does it look like to access certain services and within communities? So we show up with each other and create those programs ourselves. And we create resources that are sustainable. And so some of these programs are the Native Breastfeeding Coalition of Wisconsin, which is affiliated with the Great Lakes Intertribal Council. And they've informed a lot of policy guidelines and also administers the Wisconsin Tribal Breastfeeding Survey, which provides a lot of data to then inform programming, and really is focused from within the community and shared within the community, right? Talk about data sovereignty. And then we also have the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition, which engages 36 local breastfeeding coalitions in that state and also supports promotion, initiation, duration, and understanding breastfeeding as a sacred act. And then I also want to highlight, this wasn't in the paper, but the Hummingbird Collective in Washington provides this type of breastfeeding and chest feeding coalition support, but also doula support. And how are we bringing back our Indigenous birth justice systems and our traditional practices around birthing? and preparing, and what does that look like within the families and the role of family in a part of that birthing process. So those are just a couple examples, but I'm going to pass it on to Sara now to talk about how we can continue to advance Indigenous scholarship and really walk alongside our non-Native and Native allies in this work.
Thank you, Meena. So this is sort of orienting a little bit toward the future, kind of recognizing where we're coming from, where we are, and where we're going. And one thing when we think about elevating Indigenous scholarship moving forward is to recognize the ways in which Western research continues to perpetuate oppression of Indigenous communities. You've heard really beautifully from Cary about some of this, but recognizing that recognizing in our own work as researchers, really reflecting on how in every way, from the ways in which research is framed with Indigenous people as the subjects of research, or what we sometimes talk about as helicopter research, coming into a community, extracting information and then leaving again, not working from a relational, embedded in community kind of framework, the ways in which we still define in many ways what is research or what is science in terms of these positivist and Western frameworks or paradigms. So what even gets to be knowledge or research or science is very much still in ways that marginalize and deprioritize Indigenous ways. And then also the lack of representation of Indigenous people in academia and in health research and public health research. And so as we do that reflecting and that recognition of the ways that this work is still perpetuated, this oppressive work, we think about the ways that decolonial efforts provide us another path forward, one that's respectful and reciprocal, it's aligned with Indigenous values, one that really centers community and is led by Indigenous communities through every stage of research, from conceptualization of like what are the things that need to be taken up that this community recognizes as important and needing, all the way through the ways that information gets communicated or disseminated, as Meena was speaking to, and that really, really honor and value diverse knowledges and ways of being. Next slide. So we've already spoken to a couple of examples coming out of these models, but I just wanted to put both of these forward. The Tribal Early Childhood Research Center, which is funded federally in the United States through the Administration for Children and Families. The beautiful sort of circular image here is a model that came forth out of collaboration that was supported and fostered by the Tribal Early Childhood Research Center. And then also the Center for Indigenous Research Collaborations and Learning and Home Visiting, which Meena was speaking to some of the home visiting work that has been done and supported through these federal Administration for Children and Families as well. Both of these are really examples of deep collaboration, not just across different academic institutions, but deep collaboration with communities across Turtle Island. Next slide. So while I want to really recognize that the work here is about centering Indigenous people doing Indigenous scholarship and work for their communities, that doesn't mean that white folks like me are off the hook in terms of advancing Indigenous scholarship. And so we have these non-Native allies, as I identify or have been identified by the folks I work with. We have an important role to play in this work as well. We have a role in terms of unlearning what we have been sort of indoctrinated into in Western science and learning different ways. That's our accountability work to do. We also have really important work to do in terms of decentering ourselves and also the institution and the paradigms and the ways that science has been done so that we are making room to really call in and center Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous research. We valued this article. I've provided the citation here from 2023 that recognizes the problem with white folks identifying themselves as allies and really knowing that you are an ally when the communities that you're working with call you such and they gift you with that relationship and that identity. And that comes from building trust, critical awareness, accountability, all of the kind of items outlined here. And then I have a picture from a few months ago, those of us in this call, along with another Indigenous scholar, gathering at our child development conference here in the States to do some of this work together. And finally, I want to recognize that while there is much work to be done in the infant and earlyhood research space in terms of centering Indigenous scholarship and Indigenous scholars, there is also action happening that really can be woven together and help advance Indigenous scholarship. So these diversity-informed tenets for work with families, children and families, that it should say infants, children and families, that comes out of 0 to 3. I think they really align with the work that we're advancing here in terms of elevating Indigenous scholarship. So I just wanted to recognize another resource that, while it may not be led by Indigenous communities, it is resonating with the work we're talking about here, and it can really help us move the work forward. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to kind of conclude.
Thank you, everybody. So yeah, just to share some concluding thoughts here. So we've outlined the historical events, policies, systems, programming, and experiences related to Indigenous children and families that are essential contextual factors for those working alongside Indigenous communities to understand and appreciate. So again, the work that we do in this present moment is not happening in a vacuum. And the lives that the children and families that we serve are not occurring in a vacuum. There is a long inherited history of both challenges and strengths that have reverberated across the generations. And as individuals, whether we're Native or non-Native, we're stepping into that space. And whether it's in research or practice, it's really essential that we are mindful of that history as well as the present day context and how that history continues into the present moment. Perhaps out of sight and out of mind, but still there. We've argued for a continued call for decolonization and the reclamation of Indigenous kinship and shared caregiving practices with sensitivity for the diversity and heterogeneity of tribal nations. Here in the United States, there's 574 federally recognized tribes. That does not include all of the possible tribal nations here in the United States, but just federally recognized tribes alone, there's 574 of them. And they have diverse histories, diverse culture, diverse language. And I've been working in and with tribal communities for almost 30 years. I'm a tribal citizen myself. And I often speak of the importance of humility. And I say that through my own lived experience. And every time I visit a community that I have never visited before, even with that long history of working with many different tribal nations and tribal communities, I learn something new every time. And so I think the importance of cultural humility is really essential also in this work that we do. There's also a continued emphasis on strength, strengths-based work, community-based work, and Indigenous-led initiatives. So Sara was talking about some of the work that she and I have been involved in, and Meena and Cary talked a little bit about that at the beginning, to really serve as mentors and to do our part as senior researchers to pave a way forward for early career Indigenous scholars who are increasingly, as they should be, at the helm of the research that is serving their communities. And this is a real shift from the past, when so much of research, whether it was early childhood, child development, or whatever, so much of that research was led by non-Native people. And that everything that we've talked about, these efforts are really nurtured through ongoing reflexivity and positionality. And that Indigenous communities have dreamed and created decolonial paths to cultural connection, health, and well-being for their children, families, and future generations. So, really that these answers have always been there, and they remain within tribal and Indigenous communities themselves. So thank you so much for your time. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions, dialogue, sharing.
We do have a little bit of time. Yeah, so if we have any questions for our very special panel, and we wanted, while we all have you here, to say thank you for that amazing and inspiring, as somebody has already said, presentation, and very thought-provoking. So thank you for that. And I just want to open it up that if anybody has any questions,